Chapter 6, The Revolution Within. We've had two rather lengthy lectures for 4 and 5, so as promised, this one is going to be very short. Short and to the point, but there are some things that do need to be discussed in this chapter. Everyone in our country had this dream of equality, and the goals for our revolution were the struggle for national independence, and we needed a place in trade with the European nations. In other words, we needed them to recognize us as a legitimate government. But we still didn't know what kind of a nation are we going to become. We had potential. Man, we had tons of potential. We could have a king, we could have a monarch, we could have a royal protectorate, we could have a dictator. There's any way we could go any way we wanted to go because this Continental Congress is not really doing a heck of a lot. So we have the potential to become very democratic or anything else. And we have a lot of ideas of what liberty means and these notions of equality floating around. Women and slaves and even the free blacks begin to question the authority of their superiors. I mean, this is just unheard of. Prior to the American Revolution, everybody knew their place. At the end of the revolution, in all honesty, male authority did remain intact. We're going to be a very patriarchal nation. And for the free man, the revolution challenged the traditional limitation of political participation of property owners. In other words, what does this do? You've got to own property before you can vote. And the revolution challenged that. Now, in Great Britain, direct rule by the public, according to them, equaled mob rule. But in the colonies, if we had direct rule or ruled by the people, it meant that the government was going to serve the interests of the people, not just the elite, but everyone. But during the war and immediately after, all colonies had become states. We're no longer colonies. Now we are states, the United States of America. And the states began debating who's going to have the right to vote. Should we have universal male suffrage? Should we have religious toleration? You can be a member of any church you want to be. And shall we end slavery? Very important questions debated. And they were not all answered satisfactorily. But in Pennsylvania, is one of the states that surprisingly they were opposed to too much independence because they feared the mob rule. In other words, propertyless people having any kind of authority. But they criticized this property qualification for voting. So they did establish no property qualifications to vote. They were going to have a one-house legislature instead of two, and it was going to meet once annually. And any male over 21 could vote. They also established public schools and guaranteed free speech. As a copy of the Pennsylvania Constitution, you see how many different changes were made from the original. The original, I mean, they just kept changing and changing and changing. It looks worse than our Declaration of Independence. These new constitutions, and each state adopted a new one. 10 of the states had two-house legislatures. 3 had single, Pennsylvania being one of them. Only Massachusetts gave their governor veto power. They all wanted a Republican form. In other words, they wanted it to be the elected government and governed by the consent of the governed. They wanted it to reflect the different divisions in society. And so we need some checks and balances. So therefore, they came up with the idea of having two houses, House and a Senate. But they couldn't agree on what form of Republican government to have that's going to best promote the public good. So, I mean, there's still a lot of debates going on. But this right to vote, conservatives wanted limits. They wanted property restrictions. But they felt that no property, you shouldn't be able to vote if you were dependent upon others, such as a child or a slave or indigent servant, no vote. But of course, Thomas Paine, our infamous writer from England, wanted to eliminate all social ranks and make everybody equal to everybody else. And those on the lower end of the level certainly agreed, but those on the upper end of the level are not agreeing too much. They wanted to democratize the government and have a balance. Well, fine, except some of your southern states, particularly Virginia and South Carolina, they were they were the least democratic. As far as voting goes, you had to have property qualifications, and you didn't even directly elect the governor. You elected the legislature, and the legislature elected the governor. But most states moved toward entitlement. You were entitled to something because you were a United States citizen, but it wasn't your privilege to vote because you had money or property. Only New York, Maryland, and Vermont did not require property or payment of taxes to prove that you had the right to vote. You just had to be white and male at a certain age. Revolution expanded the voting rights considerably, and the Constitution that New Jersey wrote, they forgot to put the word male in their Constitution. Women could actually vote until 1808, and finally somebody woke up and went, oops, this isn't right, and they actually changed it and put the word male in. By the Revolution's end, freedom came to mean to the citizens of the country the right to vote, and of course the right to vote gave you the right to participate in politics. This was going to be an entitlement, not a privilege. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania had already written in religious toleration before the Revolution, and most colonies, before they became states, had supported a state church. They did discriminate office holding from Catholics, Jews, and any Protestant who was dissenting, but you did have to conform a little bit. Catholic Americans and anti-Catholicism began to weaken by the end of the Revolution. And of course, the Catholic Americans were very pleased for this, and the reason was plain, pure, and simple. The country that had helped us win the Revolution was Catholic. So the people began to say, well, maybe it's not such a bad idea, because Catholics do have some good. They did help us win the war. But our founding fathers, Jefferson and Washington and Adams, they began to challenge the privileges of the Anglican Church, because we still have the Anglican Church here. But they really wanted to avoid any religious political conflict. They did know that religion was necessary. It's necessary for public morality. But they don't believe in divine intervention per se, especially the deists, which we explained last chapter. Deists believe in God, but they believe in a non-interfering God. They also believe they need to separate church and state. And the constitutions in the different states are going to guarantee free religion, and they're going to deprive the churches of public funding. So the churches are going to be totally dependent on their parishioners. Jews in New York City were barred. In 7 states only, Protestants could hold office. Finally, Catholics did gain the right to worship freely, but some of them were still barred from office in certain states. So freedom only goes so far. Jefferson wrote a religious freedom bill for Virginia, which was adopted in 1786, and it became the model for most of the states. In the United States of America, every Christian believed that they were Christian, and unfortunately, being a Christian nation did not make us pious, and we did not always practice what we preached. But separation of church and state was going to draw a line between the public and private sphere very well. And in a way, that puts limits on government power. This is just a copy of the bill that Thomas Jefferson wrote for the religious freedom. He did a very good job. He was an excellent writer. Excellent writer. But when you expand your religious freedom, what you do is you allow challenges to religious authority. And by allowing for growth of denominations and separation of church and state, it actually expanded religion's influence. The Anglicans, the Presbyterians, and Congregationalists all faced dissent from the Baptists and the Universalists. We're beginning to see the different sects of churches arguing against each other's dogma. The Founding Fathers were not anti-religion. They were Christians and deists. They were opposed to organized religion, and I can understand that. I feel much more closer to my higher being sitting under a tree in a forest, listening to the birds chirp and the wind blows through the trees, than I do sitting in a church that's got hundreds of people sitting there, and they've got microphones and these great big TV screens. And organized religion to me has just almost gone too far. But that's personal, and I'm sorry I said that. But the Founding Fathers were worried about public virtue. And we discussed that last time. Remember, the public virtue is being able to put the good of the many, the good of your nation, ahead of the good of yourself. They all promoted free public education. They did thoroughly believe that. And Thomas Jefferson was one of the few who believed in a higher education. The rest of them thought that boys and girls should be educated. But slavery was really only one kind of what they call unfree labor, because you had the indentures. But after the revolution, we are having less and less and less indentures. And paid domestic work became jobs for women and the African Americans, free or slave. Unfree labor for white men was extremely rare. So wage labor, especially in the North and Northeast, becomes extremely common. And by 1800, the distinction between freedom and slavery, it gets rather solidified. In the North, people worked for wages, and in the South, the economy was totally based on a slave labor system. So you got to ask yourself, just what constitutes freedom? And some thought that the Republic could not survive with dependent citizens, such as the children and the blacks, etc. Thomas Jefferson saw land ownership for white men. He thought everyone should have their own 50-acre farm, be a yeoman farmer, and not have any big cities. He just didn't like big cities at all. The general thought was that with this abundance of land we've got, this is going to ensure the Republican liberty and social equality, because they're going to go out there and take over the land. And like I said, never mind that the land is already occupied by Indians and Spanish and other people. We saw it as our entitlement to take the land. So we've got some questions. Should local or national government limit price increases? There had been billions of dollars, continental dollars, issued during the war, and a lot of it wasn't worth anything. And because of weather and hoarding and price gouging, to say that there was disruptions in the trade was putting it mildly. There were even riots in some states, mainly by women against merchants who were charging what they considered not a just price. They agreed that someone should make a profit, but they agreed that you shouldn't make an ungodly amount of profit. And it's like when we have a bad storm and the price of gas jumps up at some gas stations, $4 or $5 more than anybody else. It's not because of a lack of gas, it's because they're gouging. So Congress asked the states to fix the wages and prices, and the states didn't agree. Some of them are arguing for free trade, especially after Adam Smith, our little Scottish economist, comes out with his book called The Wealth of Nations, in which he stated that the invisible hand of a free market would guarantee equality. And he thought that the government should have hands off. And this is where we're going to come up with this laissez-faire type of situation, which we have today. We wanted the government to just stay out of it, except when we needed help. Didn't be a benevolent uncle and cut my labor mine. Now, those people during the war who they were considered loyalists or loyal to England, they lost their liberties during the war and after the war. And although they had supported resistance, they had no benefit of the independence after the war. And I have it broken down here. I don't think I mentioned it in the last chapter during the war, but it was not 100% everybody for the war. There was 20% of our population of 3 million were loyalists, and 20,000 of our population actually fought for the British. So 1/5 of our population were for the English. 40% were either against it. They were against either side. They didn't want the English. They didn't want the Patriots. Pox on both your houses. Mostly in the back countries, in the mountains, in New York, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Carolinas, especially the North Carolina. They wanted no part of the war. 2/5. 2/5. So you've got 3/5 of your population that's not even for the revolution. Only 40% or 2/5 of the population were actually for the revolution. Now, I don't know if you saw the movie The Patriot or not, but it demonstrates quite aptly how there were some people that didn't have any problem with the English, and they didn't see any point in going to war. Basically, it was the New England people, and of course, the revolution started in Boston because that's where the big port was. And people in the Northeast were more apt to be, well, not punished, but because of the port, that's where the British would land their ships more than often than not. They didn't bother the South, the Savannah or Charleston, because the Southern planters, they didn't give them any trouble, but the people in the Northeast did. So of that 40% or two-fifths, I would be willing to say that more than 60% of them were from the New England area. But the loyalist, well, you didn't even have to be a loyalist. You could be a non-combatant. But if you refused to bear arms because you didn't believe in war, you could be arrested, your property could be taken, and you could be put in jail. Loyalty oaths were required. If you didn't give the oaths, out you go. And more than 100,000 of the loyalists left the United States after the war, primarily to go to Canada. And these were the types of people we needed here desperately. They were doctors and lawyers and judges. They were the educated people, the upper class. We needed them here to help us form the new government and to help the country get started. But they left. They were asked to leave, and they left willingly. Now you can see here, you didn't have a lot of loyalists in this country. The slight little blue, or not blue, but can't even tell colors tonight. Pink. You have some up here in New York. You have some down here in the port around the New York City. Very little in through here. And look at North Carolina and South Carolina. You had a whole passel of them through here. That saying that they were loyalists, I think, is really a little bit rigid. They just were not having any problems with the British. They were making money. Things were going well, and they didn't want to rock the boat. What's the old expression? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And they weren't having any problems, and they really couldn't understand the problem until, as you learn from films and from reading your texts, the British soldiers, especially the Hessians, they did more damage than good. Now, what about the Indians? Well, different tribes, of course, supported different sides, and some tribes even split internally and fought against each other. But meanwhile, even though we've got a war going on, our colonists are continuing to move west. I mean, we're like yeast. We just keep moving, and we're taking over Indian land. And when the Indians would resist, well, we would prove to take it by force. The Indians committed atrocities against the settlers committed atrocities against the Indians. It was kind of a two-way street, because the white man wanted the Indian land. And for white man, freedom meant just that, freedom to take land. And Thomas Jefferson saw war as the opportunity to move west. We had the power. We had the power over the land. We had inherited the land, so to speak. But the Indian felt that freedom meant possession of the land and independence. But for the white American, freedom meant possessing of land, and eliminating the Indian. The Indian was looked down upon more so than any other race, mainly because they had what we wanted. They had the land. Given the choice between a black slave and an Indian, the white man would choose the black slave, because the black man had nothing the white man wanted. We treated the Indians very badly, and that is a gross understatement. The language of slavery and freedom. We had more than 500,000 slaves in this country, majority of them in the South. And of course, the very word slavery is the opposite of the word freedom. And the colonists used the argument that they were being enslaved by Britain and treated like slaves. And by defining liberty as absolute value and freedom as universal entitlement, it's going to cause a lot of questions about the slavery status in our new nation. The only thing you can do then is say that the black man is not a human being. If he's a human being, he is entitled to all these liberties that we have. So we're getting into very shady areas. But before the Revolution, slavery was not discussed in public. It was just not done. Some people saw slavery as immoral, and anybody with a grain of sense saw that it was inefficient, but it was a relic of barbarism and bad times. And of course, the Quakers had been against slavery since the 1600s. But after the Revolution, the subject came up in public debate and controversy, especially when you're writing the new constitutions for the new states. Some slaves thought that because of liberty, this revolution had opened the doors to for them to be free, and they began to challenge their status, and they began to push and to press whites to, you know, practice what you preach, follow your own principles. And in New England, there were several petitions presented to their local Congress to allow us freedom. And also, the war had offered an opportunity to escape. More than 5,000 fought for independence during the war, fought on the side of the Patriots, and most of them gained their independence. Intendance? See what happens when you use spell check? Some of them gained independence fighting for the British, and more than 100,000 escaped to British lines after the war. And this caused a big problem in the South, losing laborers. That way the crops weren't planted or harvested. And so we had a bit of a time there. But during the war, of course, importation of slaves was discouraged because we didn't need the traffic, the ship traffic. Of course, the southern plantations did not agree with this. They needed slaves because their slaves were either running away to join the British or to join the Patriots. And actually, after the war, there were some slaveholders in Virginia and Maryland who freed their slaves. It happened in some of the southern states, but it was rare, as my grandmother used to say, about as rare and scarce as hen's teeth. And emancipation did come gradually to the north, but it did come. Most of your northern states, when they wrote their constitutions, wrote slavery as being illegal. Slave escapees plus free northern blacks equal free black communities. And although they didn't go out and set up their own towns that much, there was some in the West, but very few. They seemed to think that Kansas was the magic land, and it turned out not to be so. They had their own leaders. They had formed their own churches. They formed their own schools. And we began to see a growing middle class of African Americans. And strange as it may seem, we started seeing educated blacks. And it kind of surprised some of your Southerners. Of course, in South Carolina, Georgia, and Maryland, free black men could not vote, and they could not pay tax. In the other state, well, 10 of the other states they could. Women. It brought a lot of questions of gender. During the war, a lot of women became camp followers and followed their husbands into battle. Some dressed as men and actually enlisted, and they didn't get discovered that they were women until they got wounded. And then during the treatment, the doctor would discover it. And like I said, some of the women actually led riots against merchants charging too high a price. Some acted as spies, passing on information to the different armies. And some ladies formed what they call associations to raise funds. And there were several. One in particular fund that was raised. They raised money to pay the men in the army, and George Washington wouldn't accept the money. So it was illegal that they couldn't do that because they couldn't pay everybody in the army. They raised money to pay a certain group, and so they wound up buying them food and socks and clothing. Abigail Adams, my very favorite lady in history. If I could go meet anyone, as I told you last time, not Thomas Jefferson, but Benjamin Franklin is the gentleman I'd like to meet, and the lady I'd like to meet is Abigail Adams. Now, her husband, John Adams, is not one of my favorite people. But Abigail was intelligent. She loved her husband, and I guess John must have had some qualities, because if a woman as good and smart as Abigail loved him, he had to have qualities I didn't know about. But to me, he was a little bit egotistical, even though he's going to be our second president. He was also very short and rotund. At the end of the war, husbands still held legal authority over their body of women. They had authority over their property, and they also could choose the wives, choose the husbands for their wives. I didn't say that right. They could choose the husbands for their daughters. Sorry. To a man, thought they had the right for self-government. And for the woman, well, the marriage contract was more important than trying to vote. After all, her relationship in society depended on her relationship to her husband. The better off and more well-known her husband is, the better off and more well-known she is. Men considered women to be submissive and irrational and unfit for citizenship. We were on the same par as children and slaves. We were irrational. We couldn't be trusted to do things. And of course, politics was way beyond our minds. I mean, after all, if we used our minds to think about politics, then we're taking away the feminine juices that make us a woman, and our ovaries will not function properly. Yeah, that's the way it was written, folks. A woman's role was to be a good wife and a good mother and raise good Republican sons. In other words, be good Republican mother. Now, we're not talking about Democrat Republican. We're talking about the theory of republicanism. This is what a woman was supposed to do. And since they didn't give her the vote, although they did let her become, because she's going to have to educate her children, she was given the right to, shall we say, have a little bit more education. And in some instances, she was even allowed to choose her own husband, with the parents' approval, of course. But if they finally dawned on, you can't have an educated child educated by a woman if the woman hasn't been educated. So she needs to be able to know how to do something other than cook, birth children, and read the Bible. So they started a little bit. They opened the door a crack, and I call it a bone, taught her a bone, called Republican motherhood, and supposedly raised her up in the eyes of society. But she still has to be submissive to her husband. Now, there was a gentleman in Kentucky who said women should be submissive to their husbands in public, but they could be more aggressive in the private sector. In other words, in the home. And I'm thinking, yeah, sure. Well, I promised you this one would be short, so I am going to end this chapter right here and right now.